Good morning and welcome to OT Investigates. This is now the third episode in the series, and in today's episode we're going to be answering the slightly clickbaity question: is Games Workshop in trouble? Now, to answer this question, I've gone back and I've looked through the last sort of 7 years of annual reports from GW, and I've had a look at their revenue, their sort of streams of revenue, and their strategy going forward. And we're going to have a quick breakdown of how things are going and what the next few years might look like from a Games Workshop perspective. Throughout this video, I'm going to be referencing Games Workshop's goals, and just to sort of make it clear what those are in case you don't know, there are 4 main goals that they set out for themselves, and this has been constant through all years of annual reports, so I assume it will remain consistent. The 4 goals are to make the best fantasy miniatures in the world. Now, I'm not really going to be touching on this one that much because I think it's quite subjective and it's not really relevant here, but yeah, that is one of their goals. The ones that I am going to be looking at, though, are the following 3, which are engage and inspire our customers. So that's going to be referenced in green. So you'll see that one color coded in green from now on. They want to sell their product profitably globally, which is going to be highlighted in red from now on. And they want to make decisions with long-term success in mind. And you'll see that one highlighted in blue from now on. So where I think something is relevant to each of those goals, I'll highlight it in that color. We're going to break this down into 3 main sections for the video. There's going to be what's going well, what's perhaps not going so well, or perhaps I've got some questions about what's actually going on. And then the final section will be what it might look like going forward and how Games Workshop might have to adapt moving on from here. So, firstly, what's going well? In front of you now, you should have this graph here. It's Games Workshop's revenue and profit over the last 8 years. And what you can see is it has increased massively. They've seen growth probably in the region of 100% to 200% sort of above their original revenue, which is huge growth. I mean, you're talking sort of 120, 130 million net revenue in 2014, up to over 400 million in 2022, which is really good to see if you're a Games Workshop stockholder or on the board. Profit sort of not increased at quite the same rate you wouldn't expect it to, because as your revenue increases, costs will increase as well. So the two aren't necessarily completely correlated, but you can see there is an increase overall in both. I also adjusted these for inflation, which you can see now. And again, perhaps not quite as impressive. Inflation has really bitten in the last few years, so that does sort of flatten the graph off a little bit. But again, still really impressive growth over the last few years. And even though profits have been impacted a bit, it's still overall very positive if you're Games Workshop. Another thing we can compare Games Workshop to, and I'll flash it up on screen for you now, is this one here. It's basically Games Workshop compared to 3 different things that I thought would be relatively interesting. There's Hasbro, which GW is in quite a unique position of it's floated on the stock market. And very few other sort of small game developers are floated by themselves. For instance, Fantasy Flight is actually owned all the way down the line by Hasbro, and that's sort of where I've ended up there. So that's a comparable company. The other 2 are basically the US and UK sort of measures of growth. So you've got the Dow Jones and the FTSE 100. FTSE 100 is UK, Dow Jones is US. And what you can see at that sort of wiggly blue line at the top is Games Workshop's growth. And they did really, really well. You can see that initial dip in that 2020 of COVID, but then consistent growth since then. There was again a bit of a dip 2022, 2023, but overall phenomenally profitable, and that 223.82% growth is a really good sign if you're a GW stockholder. The next thing that's been really positive, and again I'll just flash up a quick summary for you now, is their investment in infrastructure. Okay, and this comes in that sort of long-term decision making type stuff. In 2016-17, they invested a total of 10.3 million in their design studio and sort of new tooling for new models and stuff like that, which is, a decent amount, 10.3 million. But in 2021-22, that had risen to over 22 million. So actually what you're seeing is that investment in infrastructure scaling up really well with that increased profit. Okay, so they are then making decisions with long-term design, the tooling for the plastic models, which, we don't see a lot in MESBG, but if you're a 40k player, you'll see a lot of those. So that's really good to see. Next thing that's going really well is their global reach. So this will be highlighted in red. they're essentially looking to grow sort of worldwide. They want to access more markets. Now, the main two markets for GW are abroad, especially post-Brexit, are Australia and America. In America, they've opened up 65 stores in the last 5 years or so up from 100 stores to 165 in 2022, which is really good to see. The Australian market's not been quite so positive. They do still conduct a lot of business out there, but yeah, it's not quite as impressive in terms of total growth. But yeah, that American growth is really good to see. The final thing is they're independent retailers. So these might be your discount retailers like your Waylands or your Elements, or in-person stores as well that they're selling onto, and then they obviously get sold on from there. You can see here, again, I'll flash up a quick summary, but around 4,000 in 2016, 6,200 in 2021 and 2022. And again, more countries as well. So 62 countries in 2016 and up to 72 countries in 2021. So again, really positive growth in that aspect. So stuff that isn't perhaps going quite so well. Games Workshop runs quite an interesting policy that's slightly unclear as to what their actual goals are with their in-person stores. The online stuff, the independent stuff is really clear, but the in-person stores are quite interesting. Games Workshop is only interested in profitable stores and making these stores as profitable as possible. So in 2017, they actually, I've grabbed a quote from them, they have 102 multi-man stores which are constantly reviewed to ensure they remain profitable. If not, they will be closed and probably replaced with one-man stores. So what they are looking to do is, if a store, especially a larger store, is not profitable, it will be closed or it will be changed. That is their policy. Now, the policy with single-man stores is less clear, but we are seeing more and more stores getting closed. And it is interesting that they are only looking to run these stores in a profitable way. The issue with this is that GW admit themselves that their stores are a great place to start the hobby, but they don't shift the highest volume of their product. And as a result, it is quite hard for them to remain profitable. We saw this actually in the survey that I sent out, obviously way too small for it to be that relevant, but I'll flash it up here anyway. What you're seeing is not many people, in fact, I did put in the crime one as a joke, but very, very few people are buying stuff direct from GW. And on a larger scale, on a much more important scale, what you can see here now is the sources of revenue from Games Workshop in the last 7 years. Blue line is in-person Games Workshop stores. The red line is their independent retailers, online or in person, and the yellow line is Games Workshop online sales. What you can see is relatively stable to begin with up to about 2017, but then it starts to dip away, and it is immediately covered by the movement in that independent retailers. Okay, now this graph is one as like percentage of overall revenue, so it's not an indicator of absolute revenue, it's just percentage of overall Games Workshop revenue. But Games Workshop revenue started with the biggest one by about 5-10% being their in-person stores at about 42%. But very quickly that's begun to fall away. And obviously this was accelerated a little bit by COVID. You can see that big dip after 2020. But before then it was dipping anyway. It was dipping in 2017 and it just continued. And actually, if you were to remove that sort of dip from 2020 down to 2021 and just draw that as a straight line, you can see it's a reasonably straight line continuing straight down. And we'll wait to see the 2023 data, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if that continues to drop and drop. The online store remains pretty consistent. Obviously, it's risen in that 2020 to make up for the dip of the in-person sales, but again, it's around 20%. But what you're seeing is that big increase in the independent retailers. So my question is going to be, if fewer people proportionally and these are going to Games Workshop stores to buy their models, how long can these stores continue to remain profitable? Because as Game Workshop themselves say, they believe their stores are the best place to start the Warhammer hobby journey with them. Okay, it's where you would go to, get advice about a paint or stuff like that. But if they only want the stores that are being profitable to remain open, and less people are going to them, I don't actually understand how much longer these in-person stores can remain a sort of key part of their business model. If they want to change the Games Workshop stores to maybe just become more about that advice and less about strict profitability, I could definitely see that being a thing. But if they are going to continue to only run these stores for profit, it's very likely you're going to see fewer of certainly the larger stores and possibly the smaller stores as well, just not existing anymore because they are perfectly willing to close them down. Yeah, I mean, even in 2022, they closed 15 stores and they only opened 10, and in the UK closed 6 and only opened 3. Like, it is not a growth aspect, and it's really interesting when the rest of Games Workshop revenue and growth is so positive. The fact that these stores are at best stagnating and arguably getting smaller, it does indicate that perhaps this isn't going to be a long-term part of their business model. I would argue that it's a very necessary part, and I think actually the Games Workshop experience would be significantly worse off if we didn't have these stores introducing us and giving us advice and stuff like that. So it would be really good to see perhaps a little shift in that mindset away from strict profitability and maybe towards just more of that advice center, as I said, like just somewhere you can go to ask for advice about your hobby. There are a few other issues as well. Specifically, I mean, this is going to get political, but around Brexit. Brexit was hugely impactful for the European market, less so abroad, but in the European market especially. In 2021, Games Workshop calculated that in refunds alone to wholesale or individual customers, it cost them about 1.2 million in just refunds. That's not allowing for that supply chain increase in price. In 2022, Brexit, they estimated, had added £3.4 million to their supply chain. That's a huge amount of money for a company that is obsessed with keeping the costs low and running at a very profitable margin. That 3.4 million is huge. But yeah, 3.4 million in additional supply chain costs. So what, again, you may see is perhaps a shift away. They've very much indicated they see, growth in these foreign markets, whether that's America, US, or China, which we'll come on to in a second. My next question is about what's happening with China, because it's been a really interesting thread to keep track of throughout the yearly reports from GW. It was clear in sort of late 2017 through to 2018 that there was a big push to move into these markets. Okay, they saw this as being a really valid avenue for them to go down. In 2020, they were quoted as saying, "We continue to focus on expanding the Warhammer hobby with a focus on North America and China." There's clearly been some growth in America. They've opened up 65 stores in the last 6 years, which is really good to see. But China has been really interesting, and there clearly hasn't been as much success out there. There are a number of reasons for this. There are very high tariffs on foreign goods, typically around 3.5 to 3.4% is what Russia and China typically have, compared to 1.7% and 1.6% in the UK as of 2018. Okay, you can see the graph up just up here. That means the tariffs for it coming in are double what they would be to other comparable countries that they are exporting to. Okay, and that inherently makes it harder to turn a profit. GW did make an attempt to deal with this language barrier by setting up a Chinese and Russian in-house translation teams. Those came online in late 2019. Unfortunately, as we all know, 2020 COVID hit, and then also obviously with Russia there's been the terrible war with Ukraine, so there hasn't been as many sales going on into that Russian market, and the Chinese market has really been shut down. The COVID restrictions were much heavier over there, so there hasn't been as much trade going on. So there has been this concerted attempt from GW to try and break in, but it clearly hasn't been that successful. Final problem with Russia and China is all to do with licensing laws, and for whatever reason, those countries have much looser regulations around licensing. And if you have had ever done any illicit 3D printing, it is very likely those companies would have been based either in Russia or in China. The overall conclusion then, I think, is that no, GW probably isn't actually in that much trouble. Their profits are doing phenomenally well. No matter what you compare them to, they're growing really, really well. And they're making good decisions, investing in the future, investing in infrastructure, things like that. There are definitely some questions that they do need to answer, though, in the next few years. And I think particularly around the stores and particularly around Brexit and China, it does just seem like perhaps there isn't a clear strategy as to where those things are going to end up. And it would be really interesting to see where Games Workshop is in the next sort of 4 or 5 years in terms of those different markets. So yeah, that's it for now. I think it's very likely we'll come and revisit this because I am finding it really interesting. And I will continue to delve deep into these into their annual reports and see what other data I can unearth. If you've enjoyed the video, again, drop a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And yeah, looking forward to see you for the next one.